The veteran had barely finished speaking when our non-com suddenly cried out and stood up, flapping his arms in an almost comical way. Then he ran back down the little hill and collapsed, with his face pressed into the ground. "Damned stabs," said the veteran. "I told him to hurry up." Stripped of a leader for the second time, our 8th group continued its flight through the brush, staggering under our load of weapons. "Let's stop for a second," I said. "I can't breathe." Hals had dropped to the ground and was trying to regain control of his breath. Behind us we could hear guns popping and an occasional German projectile falling toward the east. "As if that would stop Ivan," said the veteran. "Hasn't anybody told them, for the love of God? Keep moving, boys. This is no time to take it easy." "Thank God you were there," Hals said to the veteran, "or we'd all be dead by now." "Damn right. Now beat it." We began to run again, despite the exhaustion that prevented us from grasping the critical importance of every step. 3 other Lancer joined us. "You really scared us," one of them said. "We thought you were Bolsheviks." We came to a small clearing, which we could see at a glance was not a natural glade, but the site of one of our munitions dumps that must have been hit the day before by a Russian shell. We found a few fragments of a pack, but everything else had been burned. A blackened corpse was still tangled in the branches of a fallen tree, some 4 yards above the ground. Suddenly we were surrounded by a full company of soldiers, ready to attack. A tall lieutenant ran to meet us. "Sergeant," he said, without wasting a moment. "Killed," answered the veteran, pulling himself approximately to attention. "Damn," said the officer. "Where have you come from? What company do you belong to?" 8th Group, 5th Company, Interception Group of the Großdeutschland Division, Herr Leutnant. 21st Group, 3D Company, added the 3 fellows who'd just joined us. "We're the only survivors." The officer looked at us, but said nothing. There was a continuous rumble of guns, and, from time to time, the shouts of the Siberians. "Where's the enemy?" asked the lieutenant. "In front of you, Herr Leutnant, everywhere. They just poured onto the plain. There must be several 100,000 anyway. Keep going back. We're not part of the Großdeutschland. Reattach when you run into one of your own regiments." We didn't wait for him to repeat himself, but plunged into the brush once again, while the officer turned back to his troops, shouting his orders. We passed many other groups ready for the slaughter, finally arriving at the hamlet where we had organized the defense post in the cellar a short time before. We stopped because a unit from our division had settled in there, but no one knew anything about the 5th Company. We were bombarded with questions, first by officers and then by anxious soldiers, but we were also allowed a few minutes' rest in the shadow of a ruined house and were brought something to drink. Everywhere, harassed soldiers were digging in, constructing defensive fortifications, camouflaging, and checking over what had already been done. Toward noon, we could hear the battle approaching. A salvo from the Russian artillery made us run for the cellar we already knew, where we saw a fat soldier, a Großdeutschland veteran, dancing and singing as the earth and air shook with explosions. His companions paid no attention to him. "He's off his rocker," Hals said. "He was that way already when we got here," someone else explained. Pretty soon, we too paid no more attention to the fat lunatic who was trying to execute a French can-can. "He's too much," Hals muttered. But the madman went right on waving his arms. In the afternoon, 5 or 6 tanks went to meet the Russians, with several groups of grenadiers right behind them. In the distance, we could hear fighting, which seemed to go on for about an hour. Then we saw the grenadiers coming back, surrounded by a thick swarm of fleeing soldiers. The woods beyond the orchards were red with fire. Scattered shots were falling all around the gasping soldiers, who were dragging their wounded comrades with them. We realized that in a short time we would again be on the front line. The battle was drawing continuously closer, with its rumbling explosions and loud bursts of sound, and we felt ourselves gripped once again by the essential, inescapable anguish of the front. The counterattacks of the regiments whose positions we had crossed had been swamped, like our tanks, by the irresistible Soviet flood, for whom the most enormous losses seemed immaterial. The hamlet had become an important strategic point, jammed with machine guns, mortars, and even an anti-tank gun, which no doubt was the reason for the hell we suffered during the next 36 hours. Some 60 yards ahead of us, 2 holes had been fitted out to hide 2 Spandaus, just in front of the ones manned by the veteran and Hals, which we had reinstalled in our position of the day before. To our right, protected by the ruins, a big Geschnauz had been set up and was ready to fire, surrounded by some 50 other infantry weapons, rifles, machine guns, and grenade throwers, hidden in the ruins of 4 or 5 wooden sheds, or behind piles of wood, or half-collapsed garden fences. A little further along, behind a low wall, some of the soldiers who had fled were being regrouped and set to digging new trenches. To our left, in a trench beside the only structure left more or less intact, a mortar section had set up its position, swelled by numbers of retreating infantry troops, who were reattaching themselves wherever they could. Further to the left and somewhat behind us, above the road which cut through the hamlet, a 50mm anti-tank gun protected by earth built up into something like a bunker was aimed toward the orchards, and behind it, somewhat lower down, a radio truck had parked beside the tractor for the gun. We had watched the truck arrive while we were resting. An endless stream of orders was pouring from our basement shelter. Officers were regrouping all the fugitives, forming emergency units, and lengthening the line of defence above the hamlet, where there must have been a command post under the authority of a superior officer. From time to time, a bullet fired at random obliged one or another of our groups to dive for the ground, but compared to what we'd been through the day before, nothing seemed particularly alarming. Only in the distance, about a mile away, violent contact persisted between the last of our retreating troops and advancing Russian forces. The veteran nodded as he listened to the rush above and beyond us. "Well," he kept saying, "they're trying to make another Siegfried line up there. Do they really think that's how they'll stop the Ruskies? You, preacher," he turned to a chaplain, "ask your kind God to send us some lightning to help us out. We could use it, since there doesn't seem to be any artillery." Everyone laughed, including the chaplain, who was less sure of his arguments now that he'd seen God's creatures tearing each other to pieces without the slightest trace of remorse. A Feld looked into the shelter. "What the hell's a crowd like this doing in here?" "Interception Group 8, 5th Company, Feldwebel," shouted the veteran, gesturing at the 6 of us. "The rest invited themselves in a little while ago." "Okay," said the sergeant. "Your group stay put, but everybody else out. There are still plenty of holes outside that need to be filled." The other men groaned and got up. "Feldwebel," said the veteran, "leave us a couple of extra men to help out in case some of us are killed. We've got to be able to hold this place." "Okay." But before he was able to point to anyone, the fat lunatic who'd been dancing when we arrived proposed himself. "I was a machine gunner outside Moscow, Herr Feldwebel, and nobody criticised my performance." "You stay then, and that fellow over there. The rest come with me." So our group was enlarged by the fat man, whom we'd nicknamed French Can-Can, and a thin, gloomy-looking character. "I beg your pardon," French Can-Can said to us. "I hope you'll forgive me for encumbering you with my voluminous presence. You must see that digging a foxhole big enough to take me would be an awful lot of work." He began to talk, enlarging on anything that came into his head. From time to time an explosion made him fall silent, blinking his little pig eyes. But as soon as the danger was past, he would start talking again, more voluble than ever. "You can set your mind at ease about the hole we'll dig for you," said the veteran without a smile. "A few stones on your beer sack, and that'll be it." "I don't drink much beer," said French Can-Can, but Hals interrupted him. "Things must be pretty rough outside," he said. "Look, there are 2 of our tanks coming back." "The hell they're ours," said the veteran. "Those are T-34s, and our anti-tank boys had better notice them." We stared at the 2 monsters roaring toward us. "God help us," said Hulls. "We'll never be able to reach them with these pop guns." He began to fire the heavy machine gun, and a moment later the tanks were surrounded by flying clods. We also saw luminous impacts on their turrets, which otherwise seemed to be undamaged. Their long tubes, waving and balancing like elephants' trunks, kept moving forward. An explosion sent us down to the floor, and a Russian shell screamed over us before exploding somewhere beyond the hamlet. The tanks had just slowed down, and the second one was already shifting into reverse. Our Geschnaus was still firing at the two monsters, which were now lurching slowly backward. A second Russian shell hit the left-hand wall of our building and made the whole cellar shake. There were several other explosions, but we no longer dared look out. Then an exultant shout from outside gave us a moment of courage, and we saw that the first tank, which had been knocked askew by one of our anti-tank guns, was drawing back, zigzagging on a single tread. It bumped the other tank, which wobbled from the impact and turned, offering its flank to our Geschnaus. A few minutes later, enveloped in a thick cloud of smoke, it joined the other tank, which had completed a half-turn, and withdrew. One of them was spouting a thick stream of black smoke, and would certainly not get very far. We could hear all our men cheering. "You see that, boys?" exclaimed the veteran. "That's how to make Ivan run." We all laughed nervously, except the thin, dark boy. "Why are you looking so grim?" Hals asked him. "I'm sick," the other replied. "You mean scared," the Sudeten said. "But that's something we've all got." "Sure I'm scared, but I'm sick too. Every time I have to crap, blood pours out of my arse." "You ought to go to the hospital," said the veteran. "I've tried, but the major doesn't believe me. What I've got he can't see." "Yes, I guess a fellow's better off without an arm or with a big hole somewhere. That's more spectacular." "Try and sleep," the veteran said. "For the moment we can do without you." A mess truck had arrived at the hamlet, and anyone who had the nerve to go out could get his mess tin filled. The simple fact that we were being supplied restored some of our confidence. We felt that we hadn't lost all contact with the outside world. However, our panic returned at nightfall. The fighting flared up again with renewed violence, and in short order the rest of the German troops were retreating from the Russians, who arrived before the last of the Lancer were able to get through. We could see the oncoming moujiks everywhere, outlined against the shattered orchards. They were running toward us shouting, but the noise of our guns covered their voices. A horrible massacre had begun. In the cellar, filled with smoke from our two Spandaus, the air was almost unbreathable. The noise of the anti-tank gun, which must have been red hot, had enlarged and multiplied the cracks in the ceiling, whose plaster fell onto our helmets like rain. "Let's take turns firing," the veteran shouted to Hals. "Otherwise the guns will melt." Lindbergh, whose face had turned the colour of his tunic, stuffed some dirt into his ears so that he wouldn't hear any more. A fifth belt of cartridges was running through my torn hands into the red-hot machine, which the veteran kept on firing. One of the two machine guns in front of us had been knocked out by a grenade. The other was still firing, sweeping across the ranks of Soviet troops, who were piling up in a horrible bottleneck. In spite of their desperate efforts to break through, waves of howling men were dying under our mortar and machine gun fire. We had no idea what was happening beyond our range of vision. Directly in front of us, however, the enemy was taking a terrible beating. 2 or 3 fragments of shrapnel had come through the holes in the wall, but miraculously no one had been hit. Then we heard a heavy rumbling sound, and 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers ducked their heads a little lower. In front of us, among the living and the dead, hundreds of flares lit the darkness. For a moment we were terrified. Then someone shouted, "It's our artillery!" "Thank God," said the veteran. "I'd given up on them. Okay, boys, we'll be able to stick it out. This means the Popovs can't get through." The Wehrmacht artillery had finally regrouped and was pouring down its deadly rain onto the enemy. In the darkness of our smoke-filled hole, our faces lit up with relief. "That's more like it," shouted Can-Can. "Look at the pounding those Ruskies are taking. That's how it ought to be. Bravo!" In front of us, we could see the earth flying into the air. Lindbergh, who seemed almost mad with excitement, was yelling, "Sieg Heil!" at the top of his lungs. Evidently the Russians were no better at standing up to our guns than we had been to their waves of assault the day before. The German artillery lengthened its range and pursued the terrified Russians into the trees beyond the orchards. The Ura Pobieda of the Russians had been replaced by the death rattle of thousands of dying men, which filled the air with a horrible sound. We thought the hamlet had been saved. "Let's have a drink," the veteran said. "We really ought to celebrate. I haven't seen such slaughter the whole time I've been in Russia. We should be able to breathe a little easier now." "You," he said to Lindbergh, pulling him from his corner, "go find us something instead of sitting there snivelling." It was easy to see that Lindbergh had gone mad. He was alternately laughing and crying uncontrollably. "Get going," said Howells, who was fed up with him. "Run and find us something to drink." He gave him a kick in the seat of his pants. Lindbergh went off, holding his head in his hands. "Where will I find anything?" he asked. "That's your worry." "At the radio truck. Those fellows usually have something hidden, or anywhere else. Just don't come back with empty hands." Outside, other soldiers were celebrating the rout of so many Popovs. In our cellar, the level of gaiety rose too. Can began to dance again, and we imitated him. For a while there, I thought we were finished. Thank God the artillery stood by us. "Thank God is right!" laughed the grenadier who'd been with us for 3 days. Tears of joy and relief were streaming from our reddened eyes and running down our blackened faces. The veteran was singing and calling for drink, and we trusted him. He had saved us that morning, and if he was rejoicing, so could we. He knew how the Russians operated and had already done a lot of fighting. He told us we would have a lull, but he was wrong. The Russian units had grown enormously and were no longer the crippled divisions that had been pushed out of Poland by the Wehrmacht and driven into Russia for hundreds of miles. Times had changed. Beyond the cellar, beyond the hamlet and its trenches, beyond the thousands of mujik cadavers and the flaming woods, the Soviet mass was moving into action again. They trampled on their own dead and ours, more powerful than ever, with hundreds upon hundreds of guns, wheel to wheel. Soon, their cries of victory would drown our laughter. We had become 5 pairs of terrified eyes, staring into the murky brilliance of the orchard, lit by thousands of dazzling, quick-burning fires. The German lines had already been attacked 3 times by Soviet troops, and 3 times had repulsed them with extraordinary effort and bravery. Between the assaults, the big Russian guns pounded our troops and our artillery, which kept on shelling the enemy as long as it could. For 5 hours already, our laughter had been stilled as Stalin's organs hammered at our positions, killing many of our defending troops. The rest were either killed or driven mad by bombs. A few, like our group, who had been lucky enough to dig in solidly, continued firing haphazardly with what they had left. Our ceiling had finally caved in, and the hole in the roof acted like a chimney to let the smoke escape. The tall, thin boy with dysentery had taken Halsey's place at the Spandau for a few moments. A bullet or fragment of shrapnel had grazed Halsey's forehead just below the visor of his helmet, and he was lying beside 3 dying men who had been brought into our shelter to spend their last moments in relative tranquility. Then Halsey's gun jammed, and only the veteran was left firing, stiff with exhaustion, helped by Can, the Sudeten, and me. We felt a crushing sense of despair when Russian rockets erected a wall of white fire over our mortar trench. The Schnauz had been dismantled, and the anti-tank gunners had long since given up. Only a few Spandaus, supported by light infantry guns, prevented the howling mob from taking the village. We were threatened with being overrun or surrounded at any minute. "I guess we'll have to die now," said the veteran. "Too bad for us, but I don't see any other solution." From time to time, in the light of the flares, we could see the nest of machine gunners in front of us, heroically fighting on. The Russians pressed their attack, bringing in their tanks as soon as it began to grow light, and death to anyone who remained upright. A shell destroyed what was left of our shelter and sent us all rolling along the floor. Our cries of distress were mingled with the screams of the 2 machine gunners, and the shouts of revenge from the Russian tank crew as it drove over the whole, grinding the remains of the two gunners into that hateful soil. Hals stood for a moment, fascinated by the spectacle. He was the only one of us who had remained on his feet and could see what was happening. He told us later that the treads worked over the hole for a long time, and that as they manipulated their machine, the Russian crew kept shouting, "Kaput! Soldat Germansky! Kaput!" We managed to get out about 10 minutes before the Russians arrived. There was no longer any question in our minds. The rest of our forces had abandoned us. God knows how we managed to drag ourselves through the dead and the chaos and the lights of the flares. Our heads were filled with the sound of continuous explosions. It was impossible even to imagine silence. Hals was walking behind me, his hands red with blood from a wound in his neck. Lindbergh, who had finally fallen silent, was staggering just ahead of us. The veteran was a short way back, shouting imprecations against the war, our artillery, and the Russians. The fat lunatic was beside me, letting off an endless stream of incomprehensible muttering. As the noise of battle grew louder and the sky brighter, we forced ourselves into a run. "We're finished, Sager," Hals shouted. "We're not going to make it." I began to tremble and cry with fright. My head hurt almost beyond bearing, aching with the noise of explosions and fusillades. We kept falling, standing up again, and running on like automatons. Suddenly, Can-Can cried out. I turned my head to look at him through my exhausted eyes, and it seemed as if I were dreaming. I looked at him without feeling, as I moved one foot in front of the other mechanically and with difficulty. "Don't let me fall," said Can-Can imploringly. His hands were clutching his belly, holding in something foul, like the offal on the floors of slaughterhouses. "How can you go on like that?" I asked him, only half aware of what I was saying. Suddenly he cried out again and doubled over onto himself. "Come on," said the Sudeten in a thick voice like a drunkard's. "There's nothing we can do for him." We staggered on like sleepwalkers. We heard the sound of an engine behind us and turned to see what new danger might be threatening. A dark shape was jolting rapidly toward us with all its lights extinguished. We summoned up what was left of our energy and tried to scatter. The half-track, which was almost on top of us, gleamed with dull reflections of the blazing explosions all around it. "Climb aboard, friends!" shouted a kindly soul. We stumbled toward the vehicle, which turned out to be the one that had moved the Geschnaus into position above our cellar in the hamlet. 3 fellows who had also been in the hamlet had managed to get it started. We pulled ourselves onto the narrow platform, which was almost totally occupied by the heavy dismantled gun, and the engine started up again, carrying us across a heavily rutted piece of ground that must have been the site of several gun emplacements. The soldiers standing beside piles of empty ammunition boxes waved to us as we passed, their faces drawn with exhaustion. "Clear out!" our driver shouted to them. "Ivan is almost here!" One of the artillery tractors was blazing brightly. Perhaps its flames dazzled our driver. In any case, we plunged nose first into a deep crater, and everyone was thrown out. I think I went through the windshield. I felt a stabbing pain in my shoulder, which was already sore, and found myself doubled over against one of the front wheels of the machine. "God damn!" someone said. "What are you doing to us?" "Shut up!" shouted the driver. "I think I've broken my knee." I stood up, gripping my shoulder. My left arm seemed to be paralyzed. "Your face is covered with blood," said the Sudeten, looking at me. "Only my shoulder hurts, though." I saw Hals lying on the ground. Already wounded, he had been thrown a considerable distance and was either unconscious or dead. I shook him and called him, and he lifted one of his hands to his neck. Thank God he wasn't dead. Somebody tried to drive our machine out of the hole, but its wheels only dug into the ground and spun helplessly. We walked on to the next artillery position, where the fellows were just pulling up stakes. They loaded us onto trucks along with their gear, and we left in search of a quieter spot. In the distance, the horizon glowed red. "You've come from that inferno?" one of the artillerymen asked. He was talking to the veteran, who didn't answer because he'd dropped into a deep anesthetic sleep. Within a few minutes, almost everyone had done the same, despite the rough jolts of our progress. Only Hals and I remained half awake. My shoulder prevented me from moving and caused me great pain. Someone was leaning over me. My face was covered with blood. The shattered glass of the windshield had cut me in hundreds of places, so that I looked as if my blood were pouring from a deep wound. "This one must be dying," said the fellow, looking down at me. "I'm not," I shouted back. Some time later, we were all helped down. Every movement hurt my shoulder, and the pain, intensified by fatigue, made me feel sick at my stomach. I began to retch and vomit violently. 2 soldiers helped me to a building where the wounded were stretched out on the floor. Hulls joined me with his bloody neck and our driver, who was hopping on one leg. "You in a bad way?" Hulls asked. "You're not dying, are you, Sager?" His words reached me through a loud buzzing noise across an immense distance. "I want to go home," I said, between 2 spasms of retching. "So do I," Hulls said. He stretched out on his back and fell asleep. Some time later, we were wakened by men from the sanitary service who had come to sort out the dead and wounded. I felt a set of cold fingers lifting my eyelids as someone peered into my eyes. "It's all right, boy," he said. "Where are you hurt?" "My shoulder. I can't move it." The orderly unbuckled my straps, which made me howl with pain. "No visible wounds, Herr Major," he said to a tall man wearing a cap. "What about his head?" "Nothing there," the other said. "His face is bloody, that's all. And there's something wrong with his shoulder." The orderly moved my left arm back and forth, and I screamed. The major nodded, and the orderly pinned a white slip of paper to my tunic. He did the same to Hulls. The orderly pinned a white slip of paper to my tunic. He did the same to Hulls and to the driver, and then helped the driver into an ambulance that was already nearly full. Hulls and I remained on the ground. Toward noon, 2 more orderlies came back to deal with the men like us, who'd been left to wait. They tried to help me to my feet. "That's all right," I said. "I can walk. It's my shoulder that hurts." The orderlies lined up everyone who could walk and sent us to the canteen. "Everyone strip!" shouted a Feld. The pain of undressing nearly made me faint. 2 fellows helped me, and my swollen, battered shoulder was bared. We were each given an injection in the thigh. Then the orderlies washed our wounds with ether and stuck plaster on anyone who needed it. Beside the door, they were sewing up a fellow who had a huge rip down his back and who screamed as the instruments bit into his flesh. 2 of them came over and grabbed hold of my shoulder. I howled and cursed, but they paid no attention. With a cracking sound that sent spasms of pain right down to my toes, they pulled my dislocated arm back into place and moved on to the next case. I found Hulls outside. They had just stuck a gauze bandage onto his neck with a long strip of tape. My friend had been wounded by a metal fragment 3 inches below the first wound he had received at Kharkov. "Next time they'll get me in the head," he said. A short distance along, we found the veteran, the Sudeten, Lindbergh, and the grenadier asleep and snoring on the grass. We lay down beside them and were quickly asleep too, and that was the end of the battle for Belgorod. The German offensive had lost all the ground it had taken at such cost during those 10 days, and even more. A third of the forces engaged in the fighting had been killed, including many of the Hitlerjugend. What happened to the beautiful young man with the Madonna face and his friend with clear, loyal eyes, and the student who spoke so well? Probably they were left lying on the mutilated soil of Russia, like the melancholy harmonica player who sang of his desire to return to his peaceful green valley, if only to die there. There is no sepulchre for the Germans killed in Russia. One day some mujik will turn over their remains and plough them under with his fertilizer, and sow his furrow with sunflower seeds. In September, Kharkov was retaken by the Soviets. The entire South and Central Front was seriously shaken, with several major breakthroughs through which the enemy poured their tanks, jeopardizing our whole system of defense. A general withdrawal began, during which the Russians often managed to surround entire divisions. Our unit had been re-equipped with new weapons and rapid motor vehicles, and was used to check enemy penetration behind our lines, often achieving prodigies that were cited in the orders of the day. Wherever the Gross Deutschland appeared, our troops took heart and routed the enemy, or so it seemed. Of course, the general difficulties of our situation, our encirclement and the despair of troops forced to abandon their weapons in a sea of mud, were never mentioned. Nor were such things as the adjutant and his section taken prisoner and liberated too late, or the profound sense of hopelessness and misery that settled over the adult children we were, facing another winter of war. More human bridges across icy rivers, like the one over the Dnieper, more frozen, abandoned regiments and scorched earth and weeks of terror, like our week at Chernigov, more hands cracked open by chilblains, and more fatal acceptance of the idea of death. Generals have since written accounts of these events, locating particular catastrophes and summarizing in a sentence or a few lines the losses from sickness or freezing, but they never, to my knowledge, give sufficient expression to the wretchedness of soldiers abandoned to a fate one would wish to spare even the most miserable cur. They never evoke the hours upon hours of agony, or the obvious resentment of individuals swamped by the herd, in which each man is lost in his own misery and oblivious to the sufferings of others. They never mention the common soldier, sometimes covered with glory, sometimes beaten and defeated, burdened by the angry remonstrances of the non-coms, and by the hatred of another herd of human beings whom it is officially permissible to hate, confounded by murder and degradation, and later by disillusionment when he realizes that victory will not return him to his liberty. In the end, there was only the physical crime of war and the hypocritical and intellectual crime of peace. "That's why you're fighting," Hauptmann Wesredau, our captain, said to us one day. "You're nothing more than animals on the defensive, even when you're obligated to take the offensive. So be brave. Life is war, and war is life. Liberty doesn't exist." Captain Wesredau often helped us endure the worst. He was always on good terms with his men, and was never one of those officers who are so impressed by their own rank that they treat ordinary soldiers like valueless pawns to be used without scruple. He stood beside us during countless grey watches, came into our bunkers to talk with us, and made us forget the howling storm outside. I can still see his thin face, faintly lit by a wavering lamp, leaning over beside one of ours. "Germany is a great country," he used to tell us. "Today our difficulties are immense. The system in which we more or less believe is every bit as good as the slogans on the other side. Even if we don't always approve of what we have to do, we must carry out orders for the sake of our country, our comrades, and our families, against whom the other half of the world is fighting in the name of truth and justice. All of you are old enough to understand that. I have done a good deal of travelling, to South America and even to New Zealand. Since Spain, I have fought in Poland and France and now Russia, and I can tell you that everywhere there are the same dominating hypocrisies. Life, my father, the example of former times, all of these taught me to sustain my existence with rectitude and loyalty, and I have clung to these principles in spite of all the hardships and follies which have been my lot. Many times, when I could have responded with a thrust of the sword, I only smiled and blamed myself, assuming that I myself was the cause of all my troubles. When I had my first taste of war in Spain, I thought of suicide. It all seemed so vile. But then I saw the ferocity of others, who also believed in the justice of their cause, and offered themselves up to acts of murder as to a purification. I watched the soft, effete French shift from terror to toughness, and take up the arms they couldn't use when they needed them, once we had restored their confidence and offered them the hand of friendship. In general, human beings don't accept the unaccustomed. Change frightens and upsets them, and they will fight even to preserve situations they have always detested. But a slick armchair philosopher can easily arouse a rabble to support an abstract proposition, for instance, all men are equal, even when the differences between men are obviously as great as the differences between cows and roosters. Then those exhausted societies, drained by their liberty, begin to bellow about their convictions and become a threat to us and to peace. It's basic wisdom to keep people like that well-fed and content if one wishes to extract even a tenth of the possible return. Something of this kind is happening on the other side. As a people, we are fortunate in being somewhat less indolent than they. If someone tells us to examine ourselves, we at least have the courage to do it. Our condition is not absolutely perfect, but at least we agree to look at other things and take chances. We are now embarked on a risky enterprise, with no assurance of safety. We are advancing an idea of unity which is neither rich nor easily digestible, but the vast majority of the German people accept it and adhere to it, forging and forming it in an admirable collective effort. This is where we are now risking everything. We are trying, taking due account of the attitudes of society, to change the face of the world, hoping to revive the ancient virtues buried under the layers of filth bequeathed to us by our forebears. We can expect no reward for this effort. We are loathed everywhere. If we should lose tomorrow, those of us still alive after so much suffering will be judged without justice. We shall be accused of an infinity of murder, as if everywhere and at all times men at war did not behave in the same way. Those who have an interest in putting an end to our ideals will ridicule everything we believe in. We shall be spared nothing. Even the tombs of our heroes will be destroyed, only preserving, as a gesture of respect toward the dead, a few which contain figures of doubtful heroism, who were never fully committed to our cause. With our deaths, all the prodigies of heroism which our daily circumstances bring, and the memory of our comrades, dead and alive, and our communion of spirits, our fears and our hopes will vanish, and our history will never be told. Future generations will speak only of an idiotic, unqualified sacrifice. Whether you wanted it or not, you are now part of this undertaking, and nothing which follows can equal the efforts you have made if you must sleep tomorrow under the quieter skies of the opposite camp. In that case, you will never be forgiven for having survived. You will either be rejected or preserved like a rare animal which has escaped a cataclysm. With other men, you will be as cats are to dogs, and you will never have any real friends. Do you wish such an end for yourselves? Anyone who wishes to go but is hesitating from fear of our authority should speak to me. I will take as many nights as it needs to reassure you. I repeat, those who wish to leave should do so. We cannot count on men who feel that way, and our efforts cannot gain from their presence. Please believe that I understand your sufferings. I feel the cold and fear as you do, and I fire at the enemy as you do, because I feel that my duty as an officer requires at least as much from me as your duty does of you. I wish to stay alive, even if it's only to continue the struggle somewhere else. I wish my company to be united in thought and in deed. Once the fighting begins, I will not tolerate doubt and defeatism. We shall be suffering not only in the interests of ultimate victory, but in the interests of daily victory against those who hurl themselves at us without respite, and whose only thought is to exterminate us without any understanding of what is at stake. You can feel certain of me in return, and certain that I will not expose you to any unnecessary dangers. I would burn and destroy entire villages if by so doing I could prevent even one of us from dying of hunger. Here, deep in the wilds of the steppe, we shall be all the more aware of our unity. We are surrounded by hatred and death, and in these circumstances we shall daily oppose our perfect cohesion to the indiscipline and disorder of our enemies. Our group must be as one, and our thoughts must be identical. Your duty lies in your efforts to achieve that goal, and if we do achieve it and maintain it, we shall be victors even in death. Our conversations with Captain Wesradau made a deep impression on us. His obvious and passionate sincerity affected even the most hesitant, and seemed of another order than the standard appeals to our sense of sacrifice, which left us stupefied and incredulous. He invited questions, which he answered with intelligence and clarity. He spent his time with us whenever he was free from other duties. We all loved him and felt we had a true leader as well as a friend on whom we could count. Herr Hauptmann Wesradau was a terror to the enemy, and a friend to his men. Every time we moved or were sent out on an operation, his Steiner preceded our vehicles. The veteran, who had a good sense of men, had pointed him out to us the day after the battle for Belgorod, while we were resting in the rear, nursing our wounds. "I've seen our captain," he said. "He looks intelligent and wise." We fought 2 more battles before recrossing the Dnieper in the beginning of the autumn. Several of us had to be re-equipped before these engagements, and the most serious accusations were levelled against anyone who returned without his weapons. Lindbergh, the Sudeten, and Hals, however, were officially recognised as wounded when they came back the evening of the rout in rags, without weapons or equipment. It can easily be imagined that equipment has to be abandoned when one is on the run, but in Russia our soldiers were never supposed to abandon their arms. They were supposed to die with them, or live hanging onto them at all times. I myself had kept my gun without thinking of the consequences, like a blind man who never lets go of his white cane, and the veteran had dragged along his heavy Spandau out of habit or discipline. But I had lost my helmet, my ground sheet, the gas mask we never used, and what remained of the ammunition for the veteran's Spandau. We met Lenson, who had come out alive too, although he had left behind most of his gear. He was tearing his hair at the thought that this oversight might cost him his rank. The veteran, who was also an Obergefreiter, suggested that next time Lenson think of putting in for a posthumous promotion. Lenson's anxiety and our laughter were simultaneously drowned a short time later in the Samahonka, home-brewed alcoholic drink, someone found in the cellar of an abandoned house. It was almost surely because of Westridau that we all escaped a court-martial, which filled us with just as much terror as Soviet rockets. We had 3 good weeks of rest behind our lines in a village of dreary, identical shacks. Luckily, the weather was magnificent. I took advantage of the lull to write often to Paula, but I could never bring myself to tell her of my terror at Belgorod. Hals had made the acquaintance of a Russian girl with whom he was able to arrange a mutually profitable relationship. It turned out he was not the only one to enjoy the good woman's favours. One evening he arrived to find himself part of a troika. The other masculine member was the Catholic chaplain, who had survived hell and was indulging a few sins of the flesh as his consciousness of life returned, hoping they would be pardoned because they were so rare. From that moment on, he was never able to intone a psalm without an accompanying chorus of laughter, at which he would blush furiously and laugh as loudly as the rest of us. All went well until one morning toward the end of September, when the distant rumble of guns reminded us that we had not come to Russia to play. In fact, the Russians had just broken through the front which our troops had managed to re-establish west of Belgorod, and our grand debacle was beginning. Our generals, who believed that our troops could, if not attack, at least hold the reconstituted front, noticed somewhat belatedly that our regiments were being decimated simply to slow down the irresistible momentum of the strong Russian forces which were attacking all along the central sector. What we should have done, before even thinking of turning back to the east, now seems like a simple act of realism which should have been recognized while it was still possible. At the time, however, the order to withdraw to the west bank of the Dnieper was given very late. The line of the Dnieper meant Kiev on the central axis, Cherkasy on the south, and Chernigov to the north on the Desna, a distance of hundreds of miles. We were continuously pursued by an enemy who was fast becoming far more mobile than we, and threatening to overtake us at any moment, filling our ranks with panic and confusion. What might have been possible before Belgorod was no longer so, except at an inordinate price in blood and sweat with incessant rearguard fighting. The Wehrmacht, adhering strictly to orders, sacrificed many more men on this belated retreat than they had during their advance. We died by the thousands that autumn on the Ukrainian plain, and our battles, unheralded by any fanfare, consumed many heroes. The frontline troops, in constant contact with an ever more pressing enemy, had already made up their minds about the future. Even the most hermetically sealed of our men understood that no matter how many hundreds of Russians he killed, or how bravely he fought, the next day hundreds more would appear, and so on for the next day and the day after that. And even the blindest saw that the Russian soldiers were moved by a blind heroism and boldness, so that even a mountain of dead compatriots wouldn't stop them. We knew that under such circumstances, combat often favours simple numerical superiority, and much of the time we felt desperate. Can anyone blame us? We knew that we would almost surely be killed, buying time for a large-scale redeployment of troops. We knew that our sacrifice was in a good cause, and if our courage incited us to hours of resignation, the hours and days which followed would find us with dry eyes filled with an immense sadness. Then we would fire in a lunatic frenzy without mercy. We didn't wish to die and would kill and massacre as if to avenge ourselves in advance for what we knew was going to happen. When we died, it was with fury because we hadn't been able to exact enough retribution. And if we survived, it was as madmen, never able to readapt to the peacetime world. Sometimes we would try to run away, but orders, adroitly worded and spaced, soothed us like shots of morphine. On the Dnieper, we were told, everything will be easier. Ivan won't be able to force the barrage, so courage, and do your best to hold him off if you want everyone to get through. The Russian counter-offensive will be crushed on the Dnieper, and then we'll resume our push to the east. Through our panic and despair, an order became a duty. Our adversaries were astonished by the courage of ordinary German soldiers. 100 yards at a time, we withdrew to the Dnieper and safety, slowing down the enemy as much as we could, watching our comrades fall all around us. Our desperate efforts sometimes continued for days at a time, across hundreds of miles. When men who had escaped from rearguard units finally reached the river, they were faced with a vast human swarm. Entire armies were waiting beside the few bridges which our engineers had managed to restore, tramping up and down the sandy bank, climbing onto anything that could float. The Russians were right on our heels, pressing against our perimeter of defence, which shrank alarmingly. The Luftwaffe was always somewhere overhead and partly saved the situation, but our planes were soon outnumbered by MiGs and Yabos. Those of our planes which escaped the long-range anti-aircraft fire had to face a constantly growing swarm of fighters. The men who had not crossed the river were pressed into counterattacks at odds of 100 to 1. We performed deeds of astonishing heroism, which demonstrated once again the extraordinary resourcefulness of our soldiers. The weather was still good, and we fought many successful battles. However, these are victories which can never be celebrated. An army fighting for its life cannot speak of victory. Nonetheless, they were victories, which cost us far more than those we had fought as conquerors. This time, on the banks of the river, we were fighting not simply to take this or that town or district, but to avoid catastrophe. Everyone felt it and knew it. We had hours and even days of calm, but our anguish and anxiety always increased to a point of unbearable pressure, and we would throw ourselves back into battle to try to drive off the red monster about to devour us. This time, we managed to avert a total catastrophe. Army Group Centre passed through, and the regiments still fighting were ordered to disengage. During the night, we destroyed almost everything, leaving only men and light arms to be transported in the ferries which had been provided to embark the last of our troops to the west. At dawn, our exhausted men arrived at the river, which was heavily shrouded in autumn fog. Expecting friendly faces, they called out, only to be answered by Ivan's machine guns. In many places, the Russians had arrived ahead of us, sunk the boats and killed the ferrymen. Our men threw themselves into the river and tried to swim, abandoning everything. The Russians, of course, opened fire, shooting at the heads bobbing in the water as if they were clay pigeons at a fair. Perhaps a few Germans managed to reach the western bank. Elsewhere, our men crowded onto precarious ferries, which were fired at from both the shore and the sky. Others were surrounded and fought to the last. Most of these men were killed, as the Russians were in no mood to take prisoners. Thus we established a new front, hoping to find safety on the western bank of the Dnieper. We dug ourselves in, preparing for a long stay. This time, Ivan would not break through. It had begun to snow, and we set about arranging our bunkers, calming ourselves, reorganizing and waiting. But news spread with the rapidity of the flash that followed a Russian rocket. The staff officers had done everything they could to keep the true nature of the situation from the troops. But reality was too strong and too important, breaking down all the barriers of discretion, smashing the fragile hopes of the soldiers, and sweeping them away in a tumultuous flood. The Red Army was moving toward us from Cherkasy in the east and the Dnieper in the west. To the north, they had crossed the Desna, and a large number of our troops were trapped at the confluence of the Desna and the Dnieper. Winter had begun, and with the falling snow, a deep feeling of despair settled over us. We were exhausted and had no hope of future respite. Where could we find it? How far would we have to withdraw? To the Pripyat? The Bug? The Oder? The veteran grinned sardonically. That seemed impossible, unimaginable. One can only draw a very general view of our situation from the lines I've just written, without any of the details. I am not trying to recreate precise geographic chronologies of the Russo-German War, but to give an account of the almost inconceivable difficulties we faced. I have never had more than a very approximate idea of our movements and centres of operation, and would certainly be incapable of drawing an accurate diagram of the front at any point in the war. That is the province of the various disbanded staffs. I, on the other hand, can describe certain moments down to the last detail. A simple smell can revive a whole tragic past for me, and leave me, for long stretches of time, wrapped in memory and lost to the present. I know in my bones what our watchword courage means, from days and nights of resigned desperation, and from the insurmountable fear which one continues to accept, even though one's brain has ceased to function normally. I know what it means, remembering deliberate immobility against frozen soil, whose coldness penetrates to the marrow of the bones, and the howling of a stranger in the next hole. I know that one can call on all the saints in heaven for help without believing in any God. And it is this that I must describe, even if it means plunging back into a nightmare for nights at a time. For that is the substance of my task, to reanimate, with all the intensity I can summon, those distant cries from the slaughterhouse. Too many people learn about war with no inconvenience to themselves. They read about Verdun or Stalingrad without comprehension, sitting in a comfortable armchair with their feet beside the fire, preparing to go about their business the next day, as usual. One should really read such accounts under compulsion, in discomfort, considering oneself fortunate not to be describing the events in a letter home, writing from a hole in the mud. One should read about war in the worst circumstances, when everything is going badly, remembering that the torments of peace are trivial and not worth any white hairs. Nothing is really serious in the tranquility of peace. Only an idiot could be really disturbed by a question of salary. One should read about war standing up late at night when one is tired, as I am writing about it now, at dawn, while my asthma attack wears off. And even now, in my sleepless exhaustion, how gentle and easy peace seems. Those who read about Verdun or Stalingrad and expound theories later to friends over a cup of coffee haven't understood anything. Those who can read such accounts with a silent smile as they walk and feel lucky to be alive. I shall now resume my account of our life and how we began to regain our health and spirits, despite the distant thunder of guns. "It was too good to last," muttered the Sudeten, as we watched the stream of troop carriers and other vehicles which had been flooding back for the past 24 hours. Each house in the small hamlet had become a temporary headquarters for groups of officers deliberating the immediate fate of the men they were leading. The men themselves waited patiently beside their equipment, whose total mass must have been at least 10 times as great as the mass of the buildings. We had just been chased from our billets and were waiting under the trees at the edge of the village. Our entire company was there, grouped in order, with our equipment loaded into civilian vehicles. A rough wind swept across the dried steppe, raising clouds of dust that veiled the empty horizon. "They've thrown us out," said the veteran to a heavy drinker named Wartenbeck. "But we've left them nothing but empty bottles." They waved toward the newly arrived troops who had pushed us from the izbas where we'd been taking it easy. I packed all the samahonka that was left under the seats of the car. "Good for you, Wartenbeck," shouted a thin sergeant. "Samahonka's for an elite unit like us. The rest can get water from the troughs." I had made a new friend my own age, who spoke French well. Hohengrauer had spent some time studying in France in 41. Then the army had collared him, promising him that he would be able to continue his studies as well as provide the indispensable value of his presence in the service. Like me, he had been overwhelmed by military enthusiasm at the age of 16 and had volunteered, marching in step and singing Wolken ziehen dahin, daher, in the impeccable ranks of the Wehrmacht. Then he had experienced the war through Poland and across a huge expanse of Russia, in Belgorod, and on the sack where we were sitting, contemplating the world and the war. Like me, he had dreamed of becoming a famous aviator, piloting Ju-87S, and like me, all he retained of this dream was a vision of huge birds screaming as they swooped down from the sky. As we couldn't speak of the ordinary life we had never shared, the shattered dream we had so much desired often illuminated our misfortune. Hals had made himself scarce for the last few days. His girl, who helped him forget the war, had absorbed him almost entirely. He had just reappeared with one of his comrades in sin. His forehead was creased by an anxious frown, and he couldn't stop fretting. He unburdened himself to Grauer and me. "If Captain Wesrado won't let Emmy come with us, the Reds will kill her. We can't let that happen." "I understand how you feel," I said to Hals. Wartenbeck and the veteran, who were amused by our innocence, roared with laughter. "If everyone in the company brought along the girl he's sleeping with, there wouldn't be enough transportation in the whole division." "But there's no question of that, you bastards. Don't cry over it. You'll have plenty of time to do the same thing somewhere else. You're too thick to understand what I'm talking about." There were many jokes on this subject, which Hals did not find funny. "Are you in love with her, Hals?" I asked, quite by chance, understanding, because of Paula, what being in love meant. Hals continued to bristle. "Because it would certainly be possible to fall in love with a whore." "Sure, why not?" said Grauer, who undoubtedly was about as experienced in these matters as I. Hals calmed down somewhat. "Let's go for a walk," he said, taking us each by the shoulder. "With you two, at least, it's possible to talk." When we had drawn apart, he unburdened himself. He had fallen head over heels in love, and was certain he could never love anyone else. On that point, he was absolutely beyond any reason or argument. As for me, despite my earlier certainty that I could never mention Paula to anyone, I found myself pouring out the whole story to Hals and Grauer. "So that's why you had such a long face at the end of leave," said Hals. "Why didn't you say anything? I would have understood, you know." We talked over our amorous difficulties for a long time, and Hals decided I was lucky. "You, at least, are sure to see her again," he said, opening his mess tin. Through eyes misty with youthful passion, we watched the sky grow dark and the stars come out. Our company moved out at dawn, heading west. During the day, we watched an aerial combat which revived, for Grauer and me, all our old feelings about the Luftwaffe. Our Me-109s had the upper hand, and 7 or 8 Yabos fell from the sky in whirling flames like enlarged fireworks. Toward noon, we reached an important divisional base. 30 companies, including ours, were regrouped to form a large motorized armoured section. For the first time, we were given overgarments of reversible cloth, white on one side and ordinary camouflage on the other. We were also given medical checkups, which we hadn't expected, and drew a large quantity of supplies. A panzer colonel commanded our group, which was classified as autonomous. We were surprised by the quantity of new supplies for our armoured section. Everywhere, drivers and mechanics were giving their machines a final look-over and revving the enormous tank engines. Tiger tanks on Porsche bodies roared as their engines began to turn over. From the sound of it, we could have been at the start of a giant motor race. We waited about 2 hours for the order to leave. Hals, Grauer, several other friends and I were loaded onto a brand-new truck, which had tyres in front and treads at the back. We drove as far as some woods on the edge of an airfield. Everything was perfect, except for the whirlwind of dust raised by our passage. The new vehicles had all been fitted with huge filters against this hazard. Some of the filters were so big it was impossible to shut the hoods of the trucks or put back all of the heavy metal plating which protected the tank engines. In the welcome shade, we shook our clothes, which were grey with dust. Although we had only gone a short distance, dust had penetrated everything, especially our parched throats. "Damned country!" someone grumbled. "Even the autumn's unlivable here." A second group as large as ours joined us. We were now spread over several acres of brush. A short distance away, Wes Rado had just joined a cluster of officers who were conferring beside a large radio truck entirely covered with camouflage netting and all but indistinguishable from the leaves of the woods. Thin scraps of cloth in the whole range of woodland colours fluttered and rustled in the wind, like the leaves themselves. We were a powerful, well-organised unit. Our two groups together included 6,000 or 7,000 men, about 100 tanks, an equal number of machine gun carriers, and several mobile machine shops. There were also 3 companies of light cavalry, equipped with sidecars, who were supposed to seek out the enemy and guide the unit to him. During this period, which was already very critical for the army, materiel was concentrated in motorized units, which in turn were supposed to support selected under-equipped infantry divisions. It is certain that the abundance of impeccable, well-conceived new materiel showered upon us at this time gave our morale, which had been faltering seriously since Belgorod, a much-needed lift. Soldiers once more walked about with the assured air of men who feel that everything is going well. Only Hals was miserable because he had been forced to abandon his Emmy to a fate which was almost certainly predictable. He was inconsolable. "They should cut the balls off soldiers in wartime. That would stop fellows like Hals from making things so hard for themselves," murmured Wartenbeck. "Have you ever heard of eunuchs making war?" "Well," our chaplain put in, "geldings are just as strong as other horses." Luckily, the padre had already proved that he was as much inclined that way as any of us. Otherwise, we would have imagined the worst and refused to listen to him. When it was dark, our formidable armoured column took off. As I watched, I began to understand the powerful impression our long columns of panzers must have made at the beginning of the war when they invaded the countries we still occupied. The roaring masses of tanks, their exhausts bursting into intermittent flame, gathered speed and passed our heavy trucks, spreading out fan-wise across the large and favourable terrain. We felt curiously moved and stirred by the sight. We drove through the deepening darkness, enveloped by a terrible uproar and din, which must have been audible for a great distance. As usual, the common soldiers knew very little about their situation, and for us this movement seemed to mean that everything was going better. We felt very strong, and in fact, as a group, we were strong. We didn't realize that a general and laborious retreat was underway throughout the central sector, approximately from Smolensk to Kharkov, involving whole divisions and several 100,000 men. In our case, our rate of progress was determined by the speed of our engines, but this was not generally so. Hundreds of regiments, stripped of even the basic necessities, were withdrawing on foot, while fighting constantly against an enemy who enjoyed an almost unbelievable numerical superiority. This time, our armies were even without the horses we had used the year before for dragging heavy machinery through the snow, as most of them had died during that winter. We were also seriously short of fuel. Everywhere, columns of vehicles in perfect condition were burned to keep them from falling into enemy hands, while the infantry plodded slowly westward in tattered boots. The Russians were well aware of our disarray and worked overtime, hoping to weaken the Central Army. All our available resources were placed at the disposition of certain units, which were then reorganized from top to bottom and sent out to deal with particular desperate situations. This is what happened to our group, giving us the impression for a couple of weeks that we once again controlled the steppe. Our principal difficulty, which was clear to us even then, was the question of supply, as we always reached the prearranged sectors too late. At dawn, when our Panzergruppe stopped, both men and machines were grey with dust. As planned, we had reached a vast forest, which stretched right across the eastern horizon. We were allowed 2 hours to rest and put them to immediate use, as the jolting of the trucks had been exhausting, but we were wakened again before we had really slept. The weather was perfect, with a soft, almost cool breeze rustling the autumn leaves, and this perfection made everything seem easier. We jumped on board again, wreathed in smiles. Toward noon, the dispatch riders, who were always quite far ahead of us, rejoined the front of the column. Brief orders were issued, and shortly afterward a large part of our group turned off for a village which was soon in sight. We could hear the sound of automatic weapons, and before we quite realized what was happening, about 15 Tiger tanks were firing at a small cluster of houses. Our heavy tractor was pulling a couple of 16-barrel rocket launchers. We were told to prepare for action, and everyone flung himself down on the ground, regretting that the tranquility of such a beautiful day was going to be disturbed. There seemed to be nothing for us to do. The tanks and one mortar unit whirled like Sioux around the village, which was soon blazing. In the distance, some Russian artillery, whose presence we hadn't suspected, opened a restrained fire. Several groups were detached and sent to deal with it. They returned 20 minutes later with 200 or 300 Russian prisoners. Then the tanks drove through the burnt-out village, knocking down everything still standing. The whole operation took less than 3/4 of an hour. Then the whistle blew, calling us back to our places, and we went on our way. During the afternoon, we also flattened 2 advanced Soviet positions. The Russians were so surprised to see us that they offered almost no resistance. On the second day, we reached Konotop in a dense swarm of troops looking for transport. Our group moved to the southwest to meet a strong Russian army. We had been supplied in town under the horrified eyes of the commissariat officers, who had to give us the gas they had been saving for their own personal use. 20 minutes later, we were in contact with advanced Russian elements, which surprised us. In town, our soldiers were busy with odd jobs, like repairing bicycles. Our tanks were briefly engaged and then withdrew on orders. We drove for the rest of the day to reach a point where, according to plan, we should have been supplied. We arrived at the dump just a few minutes before the engineers blew it up. An enormous silo filled with tin cans, drinks and foods of all kinds was about to be burned. We stuffed our pockets and every cranny in our trucks with everything we could grab, but we had to leave behind enough to feed the whole division for several days, and the flames consumed precious provisions which would have made a great difference somewhere else. Howells watched the silo collapse with tears in his eyes, cramming as much food into his mouth as his stomach could possibly hold. The whole company witnessed the scene with regret, puffing on the cigars we'd been able to save. Then we had about 6 hours rest before returning to business. During this time, the Red Army entered Konotop, and the German forces withdrew, fighting hard as they went. Our group thrust violently into the south wing of the Russian offensive, and once again our tanks opened a passage for us through the enemy reserves, which scattered before our guns were ready to fire. However, that evening, the Russians turned away from the town and concentrated their efforts on us. Our tanks made a half-turn and left 6 of theirs in flames. All the guns we'd brought with us were prepared to fire, and I saw our famous rocket launchers go into action for the first time. Commanded by Captain Wezredow, our company and 2 others were used to protect the left wing of an armoured detachment. Some of our fellows squeezed onto the platforms of the motorized Geschnaus. The rest tramped along behind the machines, which proceeded at more or less a normal walking pace. It is strange how often the sense of having the initiative can lead men to confront an enemy far stronger than they. The progress of our panzers had seemed so irresistible during the last couple of days that everything seemed possible to us. Our 3 companies, in groups of 30, tramped through the relatively cool night among the ragged stands of brush scattered across this part of the plain. From the near distance, the roar of our engines filled the air, giving us a sense of reassurance, and, we hoped, a proportionate sense of alarm to the Soviets who were trying to intercept us. From time to time we could hear shots, which were undoubtedly intended for the shadowy figures fleeing through the brush. We went on in this way for about 2 miles, until suddenly we were surrounded by flares, shooting upward and throwing their light onto the ground all around us. Everyone, that is to say every one of our 800 souls, plunged down in a single movement. Our steel helmets, which in theory had a dull finish, glinted in the flashes of brilliant light. In no time the armoured cars had turned back into the brush, their formidable barrels swinging silently in search of a moving silhouette. We braced ourselves for a shower of missiles from the Russian bomb throwers, instantly aware of the shrinking sensation that comes with bad moments. 2 violet German flares shot into the sky. We knew that this was the signal to advance. After a moment of surprise and hesitation, we began to crawl forward, taking every precaution. A few men stood up and advanced bent double. Most of the Russian rockets had already landed, and we took advantage of the lull to make a leap forward. I reached a small hollow edged with low scrub. A moment later, 2 companions caught up with me, and the sound of their quick, loud breathing betrayed the nervous tension knotting their throats. There is nothing more terrifying than moving at night through a piece of wooded or bushy country, in which every shrub might release a sudden flash of white light to dazzle and blind, a moment before the intense pain which could mean the end of life. There was no way of keeping our progress silent, and for an invisible Russian waiting with his finger on the trigger, any moment might present an ideal opportunity. However, everything remained more or less quiet. The enemy, who must have been very close to us, decided to stay hidden and kept us in a state of prolonged tension. We continued to advance, slowly and cautiously. My temples throbbed, and my body was taut, ready for the plunge which might be necessary any minute. We heard a voice some 20 or 30 yards to our left, and the 3 of us shoved our noses into the dry grass. For a moment we thought we were finished. I fitted my Mauser into the hollow of my shoulder with my eyes screwed up, anticipating the first shot. However, nothing more happened. On the left, where we'd heard the noise, 2 Russians had just surrendered to some of our men. A short distance in the other direction, the same thing happened. We couldn't understand it. What could have been happening inside the heads of these men who'd been ordered to intercept us? It's anybody's guess. Maybe they thought they were cut off from their main body of men and were afraid. For at that time, when the spirit of vengeance was the rule, the Russians were just as afraid of us as we were of them. We even thought we might have fallen into some kind of trap. An hour went by before we were ordered to regroup. During that time, our tanks went back into action, and as we silently withdrew, the flashes of their guns lit our faces with glimmers of pink light. We climbed into our trucks and started off again, apparently in the same direction as before. Dispatch riders whirled busily around our group of heavy transports. About 2 miles ahead, the tanks were apparently pushing back an enemy who was putting up only a feeble show of resistance. In these circumstances, the first light of dawn fell over our column, or rather columns, for we were out of line by as much as 500 yards, both to the left and to the right. During the night, our forward troops had been firing continuously. Ahead of us, through a veil of fog, we could see a town whose name I no longer remember. The motorized troops of the Gross Deutschland were fighting through streets lined with houses with tightly closed shutters. Our vehicles moved slowly forward, with soldiers walking on either side, holding their guns and ready for anything. We came to a small square where a group of vehicles, including 2 ambulances, had stopped. About 30 Russian civilians were standing under guard beside one of the houses. We kept straight on. At the edge of town, we passed several tank crews patching up minor damage. The miserable shacks all around them were on fire. We stopped for a moment and stared at what was left of these wood and straw hovels. There was no sidewalk, no orientation or alignment of the buildings. This place, like the outlying districts of innumerable Russian towns, looked like an oversized barnyard. Watering troughs or breakers obstructed without any rhyme or reason passageways which might eventually be turned into streets. Villages buried in the wilds of the steppe seemed more attractive, with their clusters of isbas turning their backs to the north. The outlying districts and even most of the town centres I saw, with the exception of Kiev, were of incredible dreariness. We had stopped above all to wash and get water, and we knew we had only a very short time. Some men beat their clothes against trees or the sides of buildings, as if they were ambulatory doormats. Others drenched themselves with water from the breakers or wash troughs, although the day was cool and a damp wind boded no good. Nonetheless, we were frantic with thirst from the dust stirred up by our machines. German water bottles are small, so we took along extra water in anything we could find. Next, joined and encouraged by the veteran, we climbed over a low wall surrounding a small orchard. The branches of the nearest tree were weighed down with masses of skimpy, unripe pears, which refreshed our parched mouths, even though they were hard and sour. We were busily picking them when a Russian popped up like a jack-in-the-box. He had summoned up the nerve to come out of his house, carrying a kind of bowl of braided straw full of pears, like the ones we were nibbling. He jabbered a few words to the veteran who had gone over to him. His white face was trying to smile, but was only able to manage a stiff and desperate grin. His eyes were glued to the straps of the veteran's gun belt, which crossed his chest, and especially to his spandau. "Davai," said the veteran, reaching out a hand. The Russian held up the basket, from which our friend took a pear. He threw it away and took another, which he also rejected. This was repeated some 5 or 6 times. Then the veteran began to shout at the Popov, who backed away with nervous little steps. "They're all half rotten," roared the veteran as he came back to us. The Russian, hoping to save his orchard, had offered us the putrefying fruit he kept for his pig. As soon as we realized this, we shook the tree, which filled a tent cloth. The Popov disappeared into his lair. We could hear guns to the northwest. Our advance troops must have made contact with the enemy. We were ordered to move out. Half an hour later, we climbed down from the trucks again. The Feld's whistle was blowing for combat readiness. Fighting was in progress about half a mile away, in a small village built around a factory. Wesradau quickly explained that we had to neutralize a large enemy force which was holding the place. 2 companies had been detached for the job. The rest of the group would keep moving. With our guns slung, we walked toward the village, while our tractors pulled our rocket launchers and anti-tank guns into firing position. Almost immediately, the Russians, who were watching from their trenches, showered us with a rain of shells. If their aim had been more precise, it would have been the end of us. As it was, their only effect was to make everyone run for cover. Our 2 companies spread out and partly surrounded the fortified point. Then we had about 10 minutes of quiet while our captain, sheltered behind a pile of stones, discussed the forthcoming action with his subordinates. The non-coms rejoined us and told us what positions we should try to reach. We scanned our surroundings as they talked, observing with our combat sense, which by now was quite well developed, every fold and hollow that might offer some shelter. Everything was quiet, and the instructions seemed ludicrously easy. Nothing was moving, and the silence would have been total if it had not been for the vehicles of our armoured group bumping along the rocky road below us, filling the air with exhaust and deafening noise. The Russians kept quiet, and many of us thought they had already been knocked out. The immediate presence of our main body of troops reassured us, and it seemed likely that the approaching fight would be no more than a skirmish. We were ordered to move out, and from every nook and cranny, troops proceeded toward the village, bent double. Here and there we could hear someone laughing, and wondered if it was innocence or bravado. Our men reached the first houses. The Russians remained silent and invisible. I had just joined my group, which included Hals, the dear friend who so often saved me from feeling completely lost. His innocent, good-natured face smiled at me from the crowd, and I smiled back. We exchanged a look that said a great deal more than many long conversations do. The war seemed quite different to us now that we had an aerial escort. Our terrible memories of the Don and the retreat from Belgorod belonged to the past and to bad times which wouldn't come back. Of course, we knew that the war wasn't over, but for the last week we had been making the enemy run. We were watching the progress of about 30 of our men who were leaping through the ruins of a brickworks. 5 or 6 panzer grenadiers were running along beside the principal building. One of them had just thrown a grenade through a gaping window. A moment later the air was shaken by its explosion, which was immediately followed by a heart-rending scream of a kind we had often heard before. We knew that nothing must distract us from our objective. However, we saw a human figure dressed in white fall from the window and roll down to the feet of our soldiers. It was a Russian civilian, a woman, who had been cowering beside the window, probably praying to all the saints. In spite of her fall, she seemed to be unhurt and ran toward us, screaming. One of our soldiers lifted his gun, and we thought we heard it fire, but nothing happened. The Russian woman in her white shirt ran screaming through the ranks of petrified men. No one said a word, and for a half-minute the war seemed to be standing still. Our grenadiers had already kicked in the door and were in the house. 3 other civilians came out, 2 men and a child. Once again we watched as they ran through our astounded ranks. The Russians had not evacuated the village, and we would have to take the civilian population into account. Wesrado, who had just realized this, installed a loudspeaker on a half-track, which drove between the rows of houses waving a white rag fastened to a pole. The loudspeaker crackled out some nasal Russian words, while the 4 men on the half-track looked desperately at their comrades, who had remained in shelter. The loudspeaker must have been giving the Russians a chance to evacuate civilians or to lay down their arms. But the half-track had gone less than 100 yards when the irreparable occurred. It suddenly seemed to fly upward as a series of deafening explosions rang out, and 5 or 6 huts disintegrated. The truck had driven over a minefield. A heavy cloud of dust and smoke hid the village from our eyes. We could see 2 black silhouettes gesticulating in the flaming half-track and hear them screaming. "Look out for mines!" someone shouted. But his voice was drowned by the roaring of mortars and packs as the ground in front of us burst into geysers of flame and earth. Thatched roofs flew off in one piece, leaving the houses exposed, like bald men who've lost their wigs. The Russians reacted, using at least 2 batteries of heavy howitzers. Every shell landing within 150 yards of us made the ground shake under our feet and suck the air from our lungs. Despite the almost certain presence of mines, the assault whistles blew. Everyone left shelter and ran for the nearest embankment. Our mortars pounded the ground some 30 yards ahead of us to disrupt the arrangement of mines, and if possible, explode some of them. The Russians, with multi-barreled machine guns set up on trucks, poured a devastating fire on everything they could see. What had seemed so simple only 15 minutes earlier now looked impossibly difficult, and suddenly no one felt confident. There were 5 of us hiding in the rubble of the brickworks, and our faces, pressed into the ground, knocked against the dirt with every explosion. From another heap of shattered bricks, a non-com was shouting at the top of his lungs to fire at anything we could see. One at a time we risked looking out, but the whine of shells made even the boldest duck down immediately. Only our mortars and rocket launchers kept on firing steadily and profusely at an enemy who, for the moment, had the upper hand. In the distance, the metallic factory tower we had noticed when we arrived was proving curiously resistant to our pack shells, which must have passed right through it at several points. Once again, we had to jump to a more advanced position. Some men were shouting to give themselves courage. Others, like me, ground their teeth and clenched their sweaty hands on their guns, less from emotion than from a reflex akin to that of a drowning man hanging onto a rope. Accompanied by deep or shrill sounds and brilliant or fading light, the earth flew up all around us, sometimes engulfing pathetic human figures dressed as soldiers. About 30 yards away, on our left, 5 of our men, who had hidden behind a small wooden building, like a blacksmith's shed, fell one after the other. The last 2 had no idea where to run and looked frantically for the enemy, who would presently knock them off too. Finally, they threw themselves down among the bodies of their companions. A thick stream of blood ran out from the tangled mass of limbs and trunks and sank into the grey dust, which absorbed it like blotting paper. Suddenly, to our left, a raging fire broke out in a cluster of 4 or 5 sheds. Its smoke and heat climbed into the sky, and a huge sheet of flame quivered and grew with astounding speed, giving off giant wreaths of black smoke and intense heat, which we could feel even where we were. Our men surged back rapidly from that quarter. The metal roofs of the sheds buckled in the heat, and the izbas closest to the fire burst into flame. A horde of Russians, both civilian and military, ran from the burning buildings. Our soldiers shot them down like rabbits. One of our shells must have hit a gasoline dump. The resulting inferno routed the panic-stricken enemy, who paid dearly for having concentrated so many men beside such a volcano. Their men rushed through the confusion with their hands in the air, occasionally remembering the way to other Russian entrenchments. Our paks were now concentrating their fire on the area immediately surrounding the factory, and the job of cleaning up the people running from the gasoline dump was left to us. The foresight of my gun often disappeared in a swiftly moving Russian silhouette. A light pressure on the trigger, a puff of smoke which for an instant veiled the end of my weapon, and my Mauser looked for another victim. Will I be forgiven? Was I responsible? That young mujik, already wounded several times, more bewildered than anything else by the lethal uproar whose purpose was as obscure to him as it was to me, who stayed in my sights a moment too long, and then turned ashen and clutched his breast with both hands before making a half-turn and falling face down onto the ground. Shall I ever deserve pardon for that? Can I ever forget? But the almost drunken exhilaration which follows fear induces the most innocent youths on whatever side to commit inconceivable atrocities. Suddenly, for us, as it had been for Ivan a moment before, everything that moved through the din and the smoke became hateful and overwhelmed us with a desire for destruction, a desire which led many soldiers to their deaths as they pursued the panic-stricken enemy. Our big guns pulverized the top end of the village, where the Russian artillery had dug in. In the general flight, the few wretched hovels which had not been burned fell one by one into our young criminal hands. We ran full speed over ground which might have been mined. Nothing could stop us. Nothing stopped my good friend Hals from jumping across a stable threshold and shooting the Russian gunners who were desperately trying to fire their jammed weapon. Nothing could stop the glorious 8th and 14th Companies of German infantry. As the communiques later observed, with an irresistible thrust, our valiant troops retook the town of X this morning. Nothing could stop our demoniac assault, not even the rending cries of Obergefreiter Württemberg, who clenched his trembling hands on an iron grill and stiffened himself against the death which flooded from the bloody pulp which had once held his entrails. A few more of our comrades were destroyed before we reached the factory. At that point, the Paks stopped firing to spare our own troops, who were right beside the Soviet defenders. The Russians clung stubbornly to what they still had, particularly to the sector immediately around the factory. I no longer remember exactly what happened. My group joined the veteran and his men, who were snatching a few moments of rest in a large cement settling tank. We all emptied our water bottles without quenching our thirst. Everyone was covered with dust. A telephone operator settled down beside us and spoke with Group Commandant Wesredau. The fighting had died down somewhat, and the German troops were regrouping for the final assault. The veterans section had a mortar as well as its 2 FMS. Ours consisted of grenadiers armed with machine guns and rifles. Our sergeant placed us down the length of the cistern, specifying the points we should try to reach once the attack had started. We agreed to do as he asked before there was time for our terror to grow uncontrollable. These moments of waiting were often the hardest of all. A group of Russians suddenly appeared, climbing through some dismantled scaffolding near the factory, waving a white cloth. There must have been at least 60 of them, all civilians, probably factory workers. Maybe they were partisans and afraid of execution. They walked up to the veterans' men and turned themselves in. The anxiety stamped across every man's face lent great pathos to the moment. The veteran, who was fluent in Russian, talked to them. Protected by the white cloth, 4 of our men took the prisoners to the rear. It was one of those odd moments of calm, when it almost seemed as if a few friendly words between the adversaries might produce a settlement which would have allowed all of us to sit down and have a drink. But in the madness of our existence, the most simple things eluded us. Everyone was absorbed by immediate necessities. Most of us never even thought of the symbolic value of the steps those men had just taken. First steps back to the essentials of life. Even the exceptions to this general insensibility kept their wild eyes glued to the metallic wreckage of the factory, which we would soon be obliged to attack and enter. Animals, which have a stronger instinctive sense than human beings, turn and run from a fire. But we, the elect among living creatures, press forward, like moths to a candle. That is what we call courage, a quality I lack. Fear knotted my throat, and I felt like a sheep at the threshold of the slaughterhouse. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who had this feeling. The fellow beside me stared at me for a moment from his blackened face and murmured, "If only those bastards would give up." But our feelings, of course, were unimportant. The trench telephone rang and crackled out an order. 1/3 of the men forward, count off by 3s. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Like a miracle from heaven, I drew a 1 and could stay in that splendid cement hole, which at that moment seemed to me as magnificent as any palace. It was a secure refuge in which I would have spent my days in gratitude so long as death was stalking outside. I cut off a smile, in case the sergeant should notice and send me onto the field, but inwardly thanked God and Allah and Buddha and heaven, earth, water, fire, trees, anything I could think of, that I was in that cement depression, which had held God knows what kind of filth before it sheltered me. The fellow beside me had number 3. He was looking at me with a long, desperate face, but I kept my eyes turned front so he wouldn't notice my joy and relief, and stared at the factory as if it were I who was going to leap forward, as if I were number 3. But in fact, everything was normal. Dre was my neighbour. He was going to inspect the factory. Then the sergeant made his fatal gesture, and the brave German soldier beside me sprang from his shelter with 100 others. Immediately we heard the sound of Russian automatic weapons. Before vanishing to the bottom of my hole, I saw the impact of the bullets raising little fountains of dust all along the route of my recent companion, who would never again contemplate the implications of number 3. The noise of guns and grenades was deafening and almost drowned the cries of the fellows who'd been hit. Achtung! Nummer 2! Voraus! The veteran and his Spandau ran up in turn.